Hey, friendos, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Beis, Daf 32, Daf Lev, Daf Heart, Daf 32 of Masechta Beitzah. Friends, we're going to continue studying more like Beitzah-y kind of things, like untying ropes on Yontif. That's what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to get up to a new Mishnah about making like a candle, kind of like a vessel on Yom Tif. And that's also pretty cool. And then also we talk about, cooking fish and other kind of interesting sugyas. So friends, let's jump in. We're going to get started on Daf Lamed Aleph Lamed Beis. We got a little bit of work to do over here. I think I had said yesterday that maybe it was against my better judgment, but alright, so let's go weiter. So I'd say between 10 and 15 lines from the bottom of the page. First word on the line is Omer. Omer Shmuel, says Shmuel. Okay. Chosamus shebakarka. Okay. Excuse me, I had to rub my nose. Oh my gosh. Alright. If you have a rope that's tied to the ground, meaning, so I don't know, let's say you have lemaise in Achlaot, so there's the Kelim mikvah, and the Kelim mikvah has a lid on top of it. And so imagine you have some kind of covering of, on the ground, maybe some body of water or something, maybe like a Kelim mikvah, whatever it is, that you have a covering on the ground, and you have a rope tied to the covering and tied to the ground. So if you have this, basically like a rope tied to the ground, so matir, so you can untie it, because, again, if we take the example of like a kelim mikvah, so that rope is meant to be tied and untied so people can open up the cover all the time. But do not unravel the rope and do not cut the rope. Okay, fine. So if you have this rope that's tied to the ground, you can untie it, but do not unravel it and do not cut it. Now, if the rope is tied not to the ground, but to vessels, well, in that case, matir, not only can you untie it, but you can even unravel it and you can even cut it. Alright? That sounds like fun. Echad Shabbos ve'echad Yom Tov, and this is irregardless, irrespective, I don't know, of whether it's Shabbos or Yom Tov. So according to Shmuel, the key point over here is this rope tied to the ground or is this rope tied to vessels? If the rope is tied to the ground, so then you can untie it, but you may not unravel it and you may not cut it. If it is tied to vessels, so then you may untie it and you may unravel it and you may cut it. Alright? And again, this is both on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. This is Shmuel's opinion. Meisvei. However, we have a question on Shmuel. What's the question? Well, we have a Beitzah that says Chosamus shebakarka. If you have these ropes that are attached to the ground, so now b'Shabbos matir avalo mafkiya v'lo chotech, b'Yom Tov matir u'mafkiya v'chotech. Interesting. So we have a Beitzah here that actually seems to be making a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. And they say that when you have a rope that's tied to the ground, so on Shabbos you're allowed to untie it, but you may not unravel it and you may not cut it. But on Yom Tov, in addition to untying it, you may also unravel it and you may also cut it. So whereas Shmuel says that, look, when it comes to a rope that's tied to the ground, so you can't do anything, right? A rope that's tied to the ground, Shmuel says, well, nothing, but you would be allowed to untie it, but you would not be allowed to unravel it and you would not be allowed to cut it if it's tied to the ground. We have a Beitzah that's actually saying it's not so simple. If it's Yom Tif, in addition to untying it, you can also unravel it and you can also cut it. So basically we have a question that Chosamus shebakarka, when it comes to these ropes tied to the ground, b'Shabbos matir, avalo mafkiya v'lo chotech. So on Shabbos you're allowed to untie the rope, but you may not unravel it and you may not cut it. So that's in line with Shmuel. However, where it diverges from Shmuel's opinion is b'Yom Tov. That when it comes to Yom Tov, matir umafkia v'chotech, you can untie the rope, you can unravel the rope, and you can cut the rope. But Shmuel had said that when it comes to a rope tied to the ground, regardless of if it's Shabbos or Yom Tov, it makes no difference. You can untie it, but you may not unravel it, and you may not cut it. Hamani Reb Meir he. The Gemara says, well, that's just the opinion of Reb Meir. To Amar apoches lechatchila v'notel. That Reb Meir had said in our Mishnah that when it comes to this like house that has fruits in it, and we said that it's talking about where the bricks are not actually cemented to each other, and therefore it's only asur midrabanan because of Simchas Yom Tov it's allowed. That's what Reb Meir said. So here also he'll say that look, that this is only this unraveling and cutting of the rope is only asur midrabanan, and therefore on Shabbos it is asur, but on Yom Tov because of Simchas Yom Tov we'll say that it is allowed. But the rabbis argue with Reb Meir, and they say that no, actually you would when it comes to this rope that's tied to the ground, it's asur midoraisa, and it's not allowed on Shabbos, nor is it allowed on Yom Tov. And ve'ona da'ami kirabanon, and Shmuel would say that he holds like the rabbis, and that when it comes to this rope that's tied to the ground, you may not untie it, you may not unravel it, you may not cut it, regardless of if it's Shabbos or Yom Tov. But now, the Gemara asks, but 1 second. Do the rabbis really argue with Reb Meir when it comes to these ropes that are tied to the ground? But we learn in a Beitzah, that the Chacham actually agree with Reb Meir when it comes to these ropes that are tied to the ground. That while on Shabbos you're allowed to untie them, but you may not unravel them and you may not cut them. However, on Yom Tov you can untie the rope and you can unravel the rope and you can cut the rope. So the rabbis seem to be agreeing with Reb Meir that when it comes to this rope that's tied to the ground, on Yom Tov, you're allowed to untie it, you're allowed to unravel it, you're allowed to cut it. So then how can Shmuel say that when it comes to ropes tied to the ground, regardless of if it's Shabbos or Yom Tov, you're allowed to untie it, but you may not unravel it, you may not cut it? Wow. Friends, what do you guys think? Very gripping sugya over here. With the Amr Ki Tana. So the Gemara says, well, Shmuel actually holds like the following Tana. The Tanya, as we learn in the Beitzah, when it comes to these seals, these ropes that are tied to the ground in order to keep like something closed, like a lid on something. So matir, so you're allowed to untie it, okay, but you're not allowed to unravel it, you're not allowed to cut it. And this is whether it's Shabbos or whether it's Yom Tov. Boom. So that seems to be exactly like Shmuel. Sounds like Shmuel has found his Beitzah. But 1 second, we do have to read a little further. The Beitzah then says v'shebekli, that if the rope is tied to a vessel, b'Shabbos matir avalo mafkia v'lo chotech, on Shabbos you would be allowed to untie it, but you would not be allowed to unravel it, and you would not be allowed to cut it b'Yom Tov. But if it is Yom Tov, then matir mafkia v'chotech, you would be allowed to untie it and unravel it and cut it. So now Shmuel had not made any distinctions between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Shmuel had said that when it comes to the rope tied to the ground, you can untie it, but you may not unravel it and you may not cut it. When it comes to a rope that's tied to a vessel, you may untie it and you may unravel it and you may cut it. So while this Beitzah seems to be agreeing with Shmuel when it comes to the first part, to the rope that's tied to the ground, that you may untie it, but you may not unravel it and you may not cut it. And that's both on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So the Beitzah and Shmuel are totally agreeing. However, they diverge somewhat when it comes to the rope that's tied to the vessel, where Shmuel says a rope tied to the vessel, so you would be allowed to untie it, unravel it, and cut it, whether Shabbos, whether Yom Tov. But the Beitzah is saying that while you're allowed to untie it and unravel it and cut it on Yom Tov, you can only untie it on Shabbos. You may not unravel it and you may not cut it. So, what do we do? So, Taratzlach Reisha. So we found the match for Shmuel in the first part of the Beitzah, the part that talks about rope tied to the ground, Elasefa Kasha. But the second part of the Beitzah, which talks about a rope tied to vessels, is not going to work out with Shmuel, because while Shmuel does not distinguish between Shabbos and Yom Tov when it comes to the rope tied to the vessel, the Beitzah is distinguishing between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Hamani Reb Nechemyahi Ta'amr kol hakelim ein nitalin ela derech tashmishon. Okay, so the Gemara wants to now try to answer and say, well, this Beitzah is Reb Nechemya, that Reb Nechemya's opinion, as we learned in Masechta Shabbos, is that any vessel can only be moved for its purpose. So, therefore, if you have let's say a knife, for example, so a knife would only be allowed to be moved to like cut food or something like that. And you wouldn't be allowed to move it for to cut rope or something like that. And therefore, while Reb Nechemya would admit that when it comes to Yom Tov, if you have this rope that is tied to a vessel, so if you can unravel it and cut it with your hand without using a knife, well then I guess he would agree with Shmuel. However, if you're going to want to use a knife to do that, well, he would say that it's not allowed because if this is Shabbos, we said it wouldn't be allowed to use this knife. If it's Shabbos, then it wouldn't be allowed to use this knife because you're going to have to move the knife in order to cut the rope, but the primary use of the knife would really be for food. But now says the Gemara, but the place where this doesn't really work out so stark is that what's the deal with the distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov? Meaning, if we're saying, well, the reason why Nechemya is saying that when you have a rope tied to a vessel on Shabbos, you're not allowed to you're allowed to untie it, but you may not unravel it and you may not cut it. If we're saying, look, in theory, the Beitzah agrees with Shmuel that you would be able to unravel it and cut it if the rope is connected to a vessel. However, the assumption is that you're going to be using a knife in order to cut it, and this is Reb Nechemya who says that, well, you can only carry a knife for its primary purpose, which is to, I guess, cut food, but not to cut a rope. And therefore, that's why you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. But theoretically, if you could do it with your hand, it would be okay. But then, what's the deal with the distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov? So he says on Shabbos, you'd be allowed to untie it, but not unravel it and not cut it. But on Yom Tov, you'd be allowed to untie it and unravel it and cut it. What's the deal? What's the distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov? V'chitema. And if you're going to say, Shanya leilu Reb Nechemya ben Shvus Shabbos to Shvus Yom Tov, and if you're going to say, well, Reb Nechemya differentiates between Shabbos and Yom Tov. He holds of Muktzah by Shabbos, he doesn't hold of Muktzah by Yom Tov, and that's why you're allowed to untie it and unravel it and cut it on Yom Tov. Umishanya lei. But does Reb Nechemya really distinguish between Shabbos and Yom Tov? Ve'atani chada, but we have one brayse that says Mesikin b'kelim v'in Mesikin b'shivrei kelim, that on Yom Tov you'd be allowed to make a fire with vessels, i.e. with vessels that are not muksa, that are muchan, v'in Mesikin b'shivrei kelim, but you cannot use vessels that broke on Yom Tov because they're muktzah. V'tani idach, we have another brayse that says Mesikin bein b'kelim, bein b'shivrei kelim. We have another brayse that says that you're allowed to you're allowed to light a fire, burn a fire both with regular vessels as well as broken vessels, because this Tana does not hold of muktzah. V'tani idach, we have a third brayse that says ein masikin lo b'kelim v'lo b'shivrei kelim, that you may not burn a fire on Yom Tif, whether with vessels that are muchan, that are not muktzah, or whether with broken vessels that broke on Yom Tif that are muktzah. You can't use any of them. So kilu, even the regular vessels would be considered muktzah according to this opinion. And we answered lo kasha, there's no problem. Ha Reb Yehuda, ha Reb Shimon, ha Reb Nechemia. The first price that says that you're allowed to use regular kalim in your fire, but not the kalim that broke on Yom Tov because they're muktzah. That's Reb Yehuda, who holds of muktzah. The second price which says that you're allowed to use regular vessels as well as broken vessels, and that's Reb Shimon, who doesn't hold of muktzah, at least on a broad level. And the third brayse, which says that you're not allowed to use regular kalim or broken kalim, that's Rebbe Nechemia, who says that you're only allowed to use, move something on Shabbos or on Yom Tif for its proper purpose. And a vessel is not for burning in fires, and therefore you're not allowed to burn it in a fire. So we see that Rebbe Nechemia holds of muktzah even in the context of Yom Tif as well. So what's the deal? If we're saying that this brayse is Rebbe Nechemia, then how come he's differentiating between Shabbos and Yom Tif when it comes to unraveling and cutting a rope that is attached to a vessel? So Treitanoi Vali B'Rebbe Nechemia. So the Gemara answers, well, there's two teachers of brayses that were teaching the opinion of Rebbe Nechemia. The first Tana was saying that he does differentiate between Shabbos and Yom Tif. The other teacher of brayses is assuming that Rebbe Nechemia does not differentiate between Shabbos and Yom Tif, and he would say that muktzah applies on Yom Tif as well, and that is why you cannot burn the vessels nor the broken vessels. But the first Tana would say that Rebbe Nechemia does distinguish between Shabbos and Yom Tif when it comes to muktzah, and therefore on Shabbos you're allowed to untie this rope that is attached to vessels, but you may not unravel it nor cut it on Shabbos, because you're going to be using a knife, and that knife is not being used for its primary purpose, therefore it's going to be muktzah. Whereas on Yom Tif, he would not hold of muktzah, and therefore he would say that you would be allowed to untie it, you would be allowed to unravel it, and you'd be allowed to cut it. Wow, that was fun. Now we get to a new Mishnah. It says, Ein pochasin es haner mipnei shu osa kli. Says the Mishnah, you're not allowed to take, if you have like if you have like clay, if you're making a lantern, a lamp that they would like put oil in and then put like a wick in there. So if you're making a lamp, you may not sort of like, you may not kind of press it in so that there's like a receptacle to receive the oil. Because it's making a vessel, and therefore you can't do that on Yom Tif. You're also not allowed to make charcoal on Yom Tif. You also cannot cut a wick in two to make two wicks. Rabbi Yehuda says that, well, you're allowed to cut a wick into two as long as you do that by means of fire, not by means of like a scissors or something like that. And the Gemara is going to explain what the difference is. So now the Gemara wants to know, who is the Tana who holds that putting like a receptacle into a candle would be making it into a vessel, even before you've like burnt it in a fire, and I guess that's like kind of how you really finish off an earthenware vessel is by like, I don't know what the word is. Is it called brandishing in a fire, or I don't know, like putting it in a fire? So Mantana Psichas Ner Monahu. Who's the Tana who says that putting a receptacle into earthenware, essentially, to make a lamp is going to be making it into a vessel, and therefore would be not allowed, it would be also on Yom Tif. Omer Rav Yosef, Rav Meir, Rav Yosef says, that would be Rav Meir. Titania, as we learn in a Beitzah, Klicheres, an earthenware vessel, Ne'imosa Mikabel Tumah. So at what point does it receive Tumah? Mishenigmar Malachto de Rav Meir. Rav Meir says, once already you kind of put a receptacle into some earthenware, so even if you haven't put it in the fire yet, it's already going to be a vessel and already be Makabel Tumah. it says over here Rabbi Yoshua, but there's another guess that says Rabbi Yehuda, which of course would be a more natural fit. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda were contemporaries. Rabbi Yoshua was older. So let's say Rabbi Yehuda says that you would have to put it in the fire first and really make it stark, and at that point it would be considered a vessel. So we see that Rabbi Meir says that once already you put the receptacle into it, it's already considered a vessel, like our Mishnah says, and therefore you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov. Abaye says to Rav Yosef Mimai, who says that Rabbi Meir would be the author of our Mishnah. Maybe the only reason why Rabbi Meir says that a vessel is makabel tuma from the time that you put the receptacle into the the lantern, the lamp. Wait, what? Where am I? One second. Sorry. So the Beitzah said that an earthenware vessel, not specifically a lamp, an earthenware vessel in general, at what point is makabel tuma? So Reb Meir said that basically from the time that you put a receptacle into it, even if you haven't put it into the fire yet, but if you have this, making a pot or something like that, and an earthenware pot, let's say, I don't know, and or a jug of sorts, I don't know, something made out of earthenware. So once already it has a receptacle in it, it's able to be makabel tuma, even if you haven't yet put it in the fire. So Abaye wants to suggest, but maybe that's talking about larger earthenware vessels that you can already put things in it from the time that it has a receptacle. But over here, when it's just a small little lamp, a tiny little lamp that you're just making a little receptacle into it, and you haven't yet put it in the fire, I mean, what are you going to use it for? Well, you could put some money in it already at that point, and that's why so we could say that it's Reb Meir, and that just like Reb Meir would say that by a larger vessel, once you put the receptacle in it, it's makabel tuma. So also this lamp, once you put a receptacle, it's makabel tuma, even if you haven't put it in the fire yet, and theoretically you could put coins in there, even if you can't necessarily put oil in there yet. There are those who say Amar of Yosef or Eliezer Brib Tzadoki. There are those who say that according to the Rav Yosef says that our Mishnah, which says that once you put a receptacle in the vessel, already, you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tiv. So that's what Eliezer Brib Tzadik says of Yosef, according to this version. The Tanan is, we learn in a Mishnah, Al Posen Charonios. If you have plates of plates from like these Charonios plates, these plates from like this place called Charonios. Where does my brother live? Harish, that's something else. Of Apostle Charonios, these Charonios plates, Tahorus Ba'ol Ames. So in a tent of a corpse, so it remains pure. Because in order for a vessel to become impure, so if you have like a house or a tent or some kind of enclosed area where there's a corpse, so any vessels in that area become in avatuma. Become an avatuma. Now, in order for these vessels to become an avatuma, if they're earthenware vessels, they have to have an inside. They can't just be like a flat plate. So, al posen charonios tahoros ba'olamei. So these charonios plates that were flat, as Rashi points out, this wasn't a big fancy city where people need things to be beautiful. This was kind of a smaller city, maybe even a village, where a flat plate was good enough for them. So it would not contract tuma in the ohel hameis because it doesn't have an inside, doesn't have a receptacle. V'tmeos b'masa azov, but when it comes to, if a zav moves it, well then it will become tameh because there's no requirement for an earthenware vessel to become tameh by the movement of a zav. There is no requirement for it to have a receptacle. So even these flat plates would receive tumah. Rebbe Elazar Breb Tzadik Omer af tohoros b'masa azav. Rebbe Elazar Breb Tzadik says actually these flat plates would even remain tahor if a zav moves it, lefi shelo nigmar malachton, because it is not yet complete. So we see that since it doesn't have a receptacle in it, so we see that according to Rebbe Elazar Breb Tzadik, in order for something to be considered a vessel, you have to put in a receptacle, and once you have a receptacle in it, it's already considered a vessel, and therefore our Mishnah, which is saying that you're not allowed to put a receptacle into a vessel into a lamp on Yom Tiv, so that is going to be Rebbe Elazar Breb Tzadik, who says that once you put a receptacle into it, it becomes a vessel. Amalei Abaye. Abaye says to Rav Yosef, maybe the only reason why Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadik says over there by these plates that you need to put a receptacle in it, because once you put a receptacle into the plate, now it can receive things. But over here, what is this lamp fit for before it's been put in the fire? And the kabule bepshite, the answer is, well, you could already put coins in it, and that's what it is fit for. And that is why you can argue that Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadik would also say that when it comes to this lamp on Yom Tif, you cannot put a receptacle into it because you could already put in some coins at that point, even before it's been cast into the fire. Taner Rabbanan the rabbis taught in pochas in a saner, you're not allowed to put a receptacle into a vessel. Vein osen al posen choronios b'Yom Tiv, and you're not allowed to make these flat plates on Yom Tiv. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel matir be'al posen choronios. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that you are allowed to use these flat plates because you haven't yet put a receptacle into there. Okay, fine. My choronios, what are these? What are these choronios? Omar reviewed Iranios, my Iranios Omar Abai Tsoe Chakleasa. We're talking about these like plates of farmers. Alright, sounds like fun. Okay, the Mishnah had said Venosim Pachomin, and you're not allowed to make these charcoals on Yom Tif. Alright. Pshita, of course you can't make charcoal on Yom Tif. My chazi, what's it fit for? What can you do with charcoal that you make on Yom Tif? So, Tani Reb Chia lo nitzuchel lemosun leolayrin levo bayom. Well, you can give the charcoal to the people who work in the bathhouse to be able to heat up the bathhouse for you on Yom Tiv. Uvo bayom mishari, wait, are you allowed to bathe on Yom Tiv? Kidamer Rava lazia v'kodem gzera achonami lazia v'kodem gzera. So Rava so we say based on Rava essentially. Well, you could say that it's talking about not to bathe in the bathhouse on Yom Tiv, but to sweat, to schwitz, right? We learned in Masechta Shabbos that initially you were allowed to go to the bathhouse in order to schwitz on Shabbos, I think on Shabbos also, and on Yom Tif, and then they eventually said that you're not allowed to. So we're going to say here also that, well, you can, theoretically you would think that maybe you would be able to give the charcoal to the bathhouse people so that you could sweat over there. That's what it would theoretically be fit for. And that's why we're saying, well, you're not allowed to make these charcoals for any purpose on Yom Tif. Alright, sounds fun. And you can't cut a wick into two. So now, Frakti Gemara Maishna, Bisakin Delo. Become Masakin Mana, or now become Masakin Mana. So our Mishnah had said that you're not allowed to cut a wick into two. Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to cut it into two if you burn it in half, right? So if you have like a long wick, so you can't cut it in two with the scissors. But if you light it, if you have some fire and you put it in the middle of the wick and now you kind of burn it into two, that would work. Now the Gemara wants to understand why. Functionally speaking, what's the difference if you divide it in two with the scissors or divide it in two with the flame? So Tani Reb Chia chodcha b'or b'fi shtei neris. So Reb Chia says, well, because there's a little bit more context to that. Actually, what we're talking about is that you have a long wick that goes from one lamp to another lamp, and then what you could do is you could basically light it in the middle, and then you're basically feeding two birds with one seed, right? So you basically, you have one long wick, one end is in this lamp, the other end is in the other lamp, and then you light it in the middle, and you're basically, sure, you're making two separate wicks, but you're also lighting both lamps at the same time. So it's not, quite like you're just making two wicks. It's in the context of lighting these lamps, which is acceptable. All right. Omer of Nosin bar Abba, Omer Rav. Okay, so now it says of Nosin bar Abba in the name of Rav, Mochatin is apsila b'Yom Tov. If you're allowed to be Mochatin a wick on Yom Tov, my Mochatin. What's Mochatin? Omer of Chanina bar Shlami mishmei Rav la'aduye chushcha. You'd be allowed to remove, like, if you have like a wick and at the top there's like some like char, so you're allowed to remove that char because it might be making the flame like black or something, so you're allowed to remove that char on Yom Tov. Alright, that sounds fun. Tani Bar Kapara taught Vav Dvarim Nermu B'Psila. Bar Kapara says, look, friends, there are 6 things that are said about a wick. Friends, can anybody guess what these 6 things are? Gimel Hachmir v'Gimel Hakol. 3 of them are to be stringent and 3 of them are to be lenient. Okay, so what's it going to be? Lahachmir and Goldlin also l'chatchila b'yomtiv. So the stringencies are, you're not allowed to twist it on yomtiv. All right. Ve'ein mehavavin also ba'or. You don't singe it in fire. All right. Ve'ein chotchin also l'shnayim, and you don't cut it in 2. All right. Sounds fun. Lahakol. And what are the leniencies said about a wick? Memaycha biyad. You're allowed to press it together in your hand. V'shor b'shemen. You can dip it in, let it soak in oil. V'chotcha be'or b'fish te'neris. And you're allowed to cut it using a flame. Cut it in half using a flame. You know, if you have the wick that goes, as we described earlier, you have a long wick, one end on in this lamp, and the other end, the other lamp, you can kind of light it in the middle. You're basically lighting both lamps at the same time, and also it'll end up dividing the wick into 2. Okay, those were the 3 stringencies and 3 leniencies of Bar Kapara when it comes to a wick. V'amr of Nosim Bar Abba, says of Nosim Bar Abba, Omer Rav. Friends, you ready for this? It's shtickle heavy. Asirei Bavel Yorde Gehenim Heim. Wow. It says of Nosim Bar Abba in the name of Rav. Wow. That the wealthy of Bavel are going to go to hell. Ki ad Shabtai bar Marinus, because if we look at what happened to Shabtai bar Marinus ikla Bavel, he visited Bavel, Minayu Iska, and he needed a job. He needed to make a parnasa. So he came to the wealthy people of Bavel, and he says, look, can I have some venture capital? Can I have some money so that I can go into business and we'll split the profits? And they didn't give him any money to start a geschäft, to go into business. They said, all right, at least if you're not going to help me make my own living, maybe just give me a shtickle of food. And they wouldn't give him food either. Omar, so this fellow said, I don't know if it's actually, maybe it's Shabtai bar Marino said, Hani me'erev Rav ka'asu, these people who are denying me venture capital, these people who are denying me food, they do not come from Avram Avinu, they come from the Erev Rav, from all those fellows who joined together with the Yidden when they left Egypt. The Chsiv, as the Pasuk says, V'nasun l'chorachem v'richamcha, that the Eibishter will give you mercy. He will give you the attribute of mercy and benevolence. Kol merachim al abrios, if you have a fellow who has mercy and shows benevolence towards other people, biyadur shu mizar shel Avram Avinu. So memele, he comes from the children of Avram Avinu. He's compassionate. And if you have somebody who does not show compassion to other people, then certainly this fellow does not come from the lineage of Avram Avinu. And therefore, if these people in Bavel were denying Shabtai bar Marinus money and food, so memele, they must not be descendants of Avram Avinu, they must be descendants of the Erev Rav, the great conglomerate. V'amar Rav Nosin bar Abba, Amar Rav, says Rav Nosin bar Abba, the name Rav kol mitzapa al shulchan acherim olam choshech ba'ado, a fellow who is dependent upon somebody else's table, so the world, it is a dark world for him. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Noded hu lalechem aye, a fellow who has to run around looking for bread, being dependent on other people for bread. Yada kinachon biyadu yom choshech, he certainly has a dark day over there. Rav Chizda Amar avchayev enum chayim, and Rav Chizda says even his life is not really a life if he's dependent upon somebody else's table. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis talk, Gimel Chayei and Enum Chaim, there are 3 people who their life is not really a life. Ve'eluein, these are them. Hamitzap l'shulchan chavero, a fellow who must be dependent upon somebody else's table. U'misheishto moshelas olav, a fellow whose wife rules over him. U'mishe yisurin moshlin begufo, and somebody who calamity, I guess, comes upon his body. I don't know if calamity is the right word, but yisurin. I don't know, what are Yisurim? I feel like I always have a hard time translating Yisurim, so therefore, but like afflictions. Ve'eshom, those who say, those who say also somebody who only has one pair of clothing, because if you only have one, thing of clothing, well then you can't really ever wash it. You get like lice and stuff. Whereas Tanakama doesn't include that one because I guess theoretically there are ways of removing the lice even from that one article of clothing, but definitely sounds b'di'evet. Okay. Friends, moving on to the next Mishnah. In shofar nesacheres, you don't break earthenware. Vein chotchen nesanir, and you don't cut up paper litzlos bo maliach so that you can cook like a herring. If you have a salty fish, so if you would cook it directly on like the pan or the griddle, it would get very hot and it would ruin the fish. So the way that the solution was, they would like cut up some earthenware and then cook the fish on that, or they would like cut up paper and then get it wet and cook the fish on that. They had different mahalchim. Whoa, is that my brother? Somebody just slammed the door. The whole house shaked. So where were we again? So you're not allowed to break up this earthenware or to cut up paper for the purpose of cooking fish. You're not allowed to shovel out an oven or a stove of a mechabshin, but you can like flatten the ground in the oven. All right, sounds fun. You can pat it down, I guess. You cannot take two barrels and put them next to each other and put a pot on, like in between and like some fire on the floor, I guess, over there, because you're basically making an ohel because you have like two walls and a roof. You can't rest a pot on a piece of wood, all right? And similarly, a door. The assumption right now is that what it means is that you may not take a pot and put it on a door. Like if the door is on the floor, I guess, don't put the pot on top of that, all right? And you may not lead an animal with a stick on Yom Tiv. Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Matir, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon says you can use a stick. Okay, these sound like really fun sugyas to me. Says the Gemara. So the Mishnah said in Shovenis Acheres vein Chotchenes Anir Litzlos B'Maliach, you're not allowed to break up earthenware and you're not allowed to cut up paper so that you could roast fish on it. My time will come, mishum dekam misaken mana, because you're going to be fixing up a vessel. I guess this earthenware or this paper, we don't want you sort of like cutting it to size, I guess, on Yom Tif. All right, and the Mishnah had said, "When gorfen toner v'chiraim," you're not allowed to sweep out an oven or a stove. All right. Tani Rav Chia bar Yosef Kamid Rav Nachman. All right, so Rav Chia bar Yosef taught before Rav Nachman. V'im efshar lefos elim kin gorfo mutter. Interesting. But if basically the oven is unusable unless you sweep it out or shovel it out, so then it is permitted, right? So like if you have to bake bread or something, but there's too much charcoal and it's just, you have to sweep it out, so then that's okay. Tevisudu Rav Chia Nafal la aricha betanura biyomatava. Reb Chia's wife, a brick from the oven fell into the oven on Yom Tif, to the extent that it was going, like if you were baking bread, so it would kind of hit this brick that fell in, like it would interact with the brick that fell in, like it was things were going to get burnt, it wasn't going to work out. Amar le Reb Chia, so Reb Chia said to her, Chazi de anarifta ma'ai sabina, he says, look, I'd like some really geshmaka bread, meaning, it's okay. You could take out the brick, do whatever it is. It's Yom Tif. You can do whatever you want. You could remove the brick from the oven if it means that we'll be able to have geshmaka bread. Omer Rava l'shamoi. Rava said to his attendant, Tovi li baravoza v'izdar mecharocha. Rava said to his attendant, look, make for me a goose and make sure it doesn't get charred. Meaning again, like, if there was stuff on the bottom of the oven that would be interacting with the goose and it would make it get burnt, so you could shovel out that stuff. Omer le Ravina le Ravashi. Ravina says to Ravashi, Omer lon Rav Acham Mehutzel. That Rav Acham Mehutzel said to us, Demar, that master Ravashi, Sharkin le Tanura biyoma tava, that you would seal the oven on Yom Tov so that the heat wouldn't escape with like mud. So meaning the point was, how can you be like kneading the mud on Yom Tov to make the mud that you're gonna insulate the oven with? So Amarle, so Rav Ashi responded, Onon ariksa defara samchina. We rely upon the mud of the Euphrates, which is like a good geschmack of mud that we don't need to knead it on Yom Tov. But you would have had to already set it aside from the day before to be using as your mud to be insulating and closing off your oven. Ravina v'kit mashari, and says Ravina, you're allowed to knead ashes on Yom Tov because they don't really knead very well. All right. You can't take two barrels and put them next to each other and put a pot on top because it's like making an ohel. Rav Nachman says that if you have stones in the bathroom, mutter l'tzadon b'Yom Tov. This is very interesting. Says Rav Nachman, you could take two stones. It's like basically making an improvised toilet seat. Sounds like fun. So basically, they would take like two stones and they would put them next to each other, two like bigger kind of stones. Put them next to each other, and you could sit on it, and there's your improvised toilet seat. So you're allowed to do that on Yom Tov. Esvei Rav Rav Nachman. Rav asks the kasha to Rav Nachman. He says, I don't get it. In Makifin shtei chavis l'shvos alein es hagedera. Our Mishnah said that you can't take two barrels, put them next to each other, and then put a pot on top of that, because it's going to be like making an oil. So why are you allowed to take two stones, put them next to each other, and then you sit on top of it? Isn't that similar to the two barrels next to each other with a pot on top of it? Swap out the pot for you. Swap out the barrels for stones. So Amar Le Shiny Hasam Mishum de Ka'avid Oyala. So Rav Nachman says, well, it's different because with the two barrels and the pot, you're actually making an ohel, where over here it's really just like two stones next to each other. And I guess it isn't the right over here. There's no roof on it. You're the roof, and I guess you don't make a very good roof. Amalei Rabazuta the Ravashi, but it says Rabazuta to Ravashi, El me'ata bona itztaba b'yomtiv dilo avad oala. But what if you make, what if you make kind of like a more permanent toilet seat on Yom Tov, right? So let's say instead of just using two random stones, what if you like take brick and like you actually like build like a very nice toilet seat there? Hachinami desharu, we're going to say that that it's allowed because you're not making an oil. Omarle. So Ravashi answers, Hasum binyan keva asur Torah binyan arai lo asur Torah. He says, okay, so look, this is really what's going on, is that the issue at hand over here is, are we making a permanent structure or not? So therefore, when it comes to if you make like kind of a permanent toilet seat over there with like bricks and mortar and stuff, that would be a problem. Now where am I? But the rabbis then made a gezerah. They made a gezerah to Rabbanon against even temporary structures. So therefore, if you make a permanent toilet seat, it's going to be a problem because it's a permanent structure. Now, if you take two barrels and put them next to each other and put a pot on top, that's also going to be a problem. It's a temporary structure, but the rabbi said don't even make the temporary structures out of concern for making the permanent structures. Now, but over here by the makeshift toilet seat, mishum kvoda lo gazu be'rabanan, out of kavod abrios, so the person can go to the bathroom with dignity. They said, you know what? If you're just going to be taking two stones and sitting on top of that, no, it's okay. We're not going to make a gezerah out of concern that you might make a more of a permanent situation. So all right, let's actually go a shtickle weiter. Amar of Yehuda says, madurta. If you make like a bonfire. You ever been to camp before? You ever been with like kids, maybe Lag BaOmer, when they make a bonfire and they like stack it up and there's a whole thing from, you make layers and all sorts of things. So milamaila lemata shari, milamata lemaila also. So if you build it from the top down, so if you kind of hold like the roof first of the bonfire and then put the lower layers underneath that, it's permitted because it's not the normal way of building. But if you would first like build it from the bottom up, so that would be a problem. Also, if you have like a very big egg, not talking about like small eggs, talking about big like tefach sized eggs, and I guess if you want to like fry it on Yom Tov or something, so you wouldn't first put the pan on the fire and then put the egg on top of that. You would first put the egg in the pan and then put the pan on the fire. Kedera, also, if you want to put like a pot on top of 2 barrels, so I kind of, as the Mishnah said, don't take 2 barrels and then put a pot on top of it, but you could hold the pot and then take 2 barrels and slide it underneath. Puria, also if you're constructing a bed made out of pieces, also don't start from the legs and build it in the normal way, but start with kind of laying out the I guess like thing under the mattress and then put the legs under that. All right. Chavisa, and similarly barrels. If you're like storing barrels and organizing barrels, also don't have 2 barrels and stack a third on top of it. Rather hold on to the 3rd barrel and then slide the 2 underneath them. I guess we don't want you constructing it and building these things in the normal way. All right, that's really fun stuff, friends. That was Daf Lamed Beis of Masechta Beah. So, okay, the first part of the daf was talking about tying ropes and untying ropes, really, on Yom Tov. We had the opinion of Shmuel, who says that if you have a rope that's tied to the ground, you're allowed to untie it. You're not allowed to unravel it. You're not allowed to cut it, and that's both on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But if it's tied to a vessel, you can untie it, unravel it, and uncut it, and cut it as well. We saw the opinion of Reb Meir, who seems to be saying that, well, and the rabbis agree with him, they make a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov, that they say when it comes to a rope that's tied to the ground, on Shabbos you're allowed to untie it, but you may not unravel it, you may not cut it, but on Yom Tov you're allowed to untie it and unravel it and uncut it. And then we had a Beitzah essentially that basically supports Shmuel, and we said that it was Reb Nechemiah's opinion. We then got into Reb Nechemiah's opinion. Interestingly, there are 2 Tanoim who teach Rabbi Nechemiah's opinion. First of all, what is Rabbi Nechemiah's opinion when it comes to muksa? Rabbi Nechemiah's opinion when it comes to muksa is that you're not allowed to move something on Shabbos except for its purpose. So a knife I could use to cut food. I cannot use a knife to cut a rope, for example. Now there was one Tana who says that Rabbi Nechemiah only talks about muksa on Shabbos but not on Yom Tov. There's another Tana though who says that according to Rabbi Nechemiah, muksa applies both on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So okay, go figure. Fine. Then we saw a Mishnah that says that you're not allowed to make a receptacle in a lamp on Yom Tov, because even just putting the receptacle in there is already going to make it a vessel. The question was, whose opinion is that? First, we wanted to say that it is, we have one version of Rav Yosef who says that it's Rav Meir's opinion. We have another version of Rav Yosef who says that it's Rav Elazar Bar Tzadok's opinion. Okay. That was fun stuff. We talked about how to make 2 wicks. If you want to divide a wick in 2, on Yom Tov, so you kind of like put the wick, one wick in this lamp and the other end of the wick in the other lamp, then you can kind of light it in the middle, make 2 wicks. And then we saw an interesting Gemara that anybody who has mercy and compassion on other people comes from the lineage of Avraham Avinu. If you don't have compassion on other people, then you do not come from the lineage of Avraham Avinu. Alright, fine. We got to some other interesting stuff. Fine, we talked about you're not allowed to make a temporary, you're not allowed to make a permanent dwelling on Shabbos and Yom Tov. You're also not allowed to make a temporary dwelling out of concern that you might make a permanent one. But we say that when it comes to making a makeshift toilet seat, that would be acceptable. We won't make a gzera there out of kavod habrios. Friends, that was Daf Lamed Beis of Masechta Beitzah. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace out.